Hey everyone, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder that what you're about to see here is part two of my lecture from fall of 2020. So if anything that you see in the upcoming video seems outdated, if I make any references to things that were going on in 2021, that's why. All right, so that's all I have to say. Let's dive into it.
All right, so let's continue with this lecture as we move into speaking about or examining the ancient period, which begins somewhere around circa 2100 BCE and comes to an end. History definitively marks 476 CE for reasons that we'll talk about when we get there, as the 476 CE as the moment, the year that the ancient period ended. Very specific date. Again, we'll talk about why as we get there. So, the ancient period gives us the beginning of civilization. And specifically, we are going to dive into the two earliest highly organized civilizations that we know of. Specifically, ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. Those Neolithic developments that we were talking about, the villages and the agricultural revolution, began to make cities possible. Civilization, that word is based on the Latin word civilis, which means city or citizen. I said words. There's only one word, civilis. How we mark when civilization has arrived, when historians look back and try to mark when civilization has arrived in a region, they look for certain things. Civilization is marked specifically by a division of labor, because you have the people who have to work the land, you have those who are the religious class, you have those who are the more wealthy class. You start to have class divisions based on labor, or organized government, organized religion. Arts and crafts begin to be more integrated, if you will, into a civilization. The sciences, and very importantly, written language. Once we have civilizations, we begin to see written language. That written language, then, is why we know more about the ancient world than we do the prehistoric world, the Stone Age. So first off, Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia translates literally into the land between the rivers. It existed in the what is referred to as the Fertile Crescent. It's this area that you see highlighted in green here in the Middle East, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates made this particular area much more fertile for cultivation, which is why the agricultural revolution begins there, and that really begins to allow civilization to flourish in this region. Now, so I'm not trying to ask anyone to question their religious beliefs. All right, but when we go into the Judeo-Christian Bible, we go to the book of Genesis. Regardless of whether or not you believe that the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is literally true or is allegorical, I'm not asking you to make up your mind one way or the other on that. It is, however, interesting that, and I think it's an important thing to sort of point out, that two of the three rivers that the book of Genesis says runs through the Garden of Eden are the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? There's a reason for that, because those who would have been writing that information down would have looked to Mesopotamia as the place of their origin. That is where we came from. That would be the way of thinking, right? So it makes sense to place where the first human beings came from in that region. The ancient Mesopotamia gets divided into three kingdoms. Right? There's Sumer, with some dates for when it existed. Akkad, which existed with some dates that are listed there as well. And then eventually Babylon, the civilization of Babylon. The Sumerians, from Sumer, many historians will literally say that history begins at Sumer. Why? Because the Sumerians developed the world's first writing. They developed the wheel. They are the ones who invented the plow. And they sought a just and stable society that was based on laws, codes, and cultural enrichment that you're going to find out from Professor McIntosh. Gilgamesh was the most inspirational king of that period, and he has as exploits get written about. Akkad, as I mentioned there, conquered Sumer and incorporated their culture into their own, and then spread outward, acquiring a large empire. And the first ruler of Akkad, Sargon, has a legend that is very similar to Moses, interestingly. He was a baby placed in a basket and floated down a river to save his life, very similar to Moses. And then Babylon comes along, and it builds upon the earlier cultures. And the most renowned leader of the Babylonians was Hammurabi. You're gonna hear about him from Professor McIntosh as well. The art of this time is reflective of what they found to be important. This and an interesting thing is that the Mesopotamian artistic style is the style that blends naturalistic and abstract forms, so that you get something like this. This is a lyre. It would have been an instrument that would have been played at parties and festivals and things of that nature. And so this part back here is something that has been built for displaying the pieces of it that actually still exist. The lyre itself we don't have. This is modern. But this bull's head and this plate up here would have been attached to an actual lyre that would have been used for making music at the time. And again, with what I was just talking about, you'll see this combination of naturalism and abstraction. What do I mean? Well, look at the calf. The bull's face, that muzzle, the eyes, the horns, and the ears, for that matter, is all meant to look very naturalistic and very realistic. It's meant to look like how a bull might look, right? But then look at that weird beard that's hanging down from it, that is made to have these very abstract representations of the curls of the beard. But it's this flat shape with very flat geometric shapes and lines meant to be an abstracted representation of a beard, and not one that looks like an actual flowing beard of hair, right? And then the frontispiece here, this plaque that would have been on the front part of the lyre, right, represents different heroic stories from different legends that would have been told at the time. Another example of, in this case, Akkadian artistry is this what is referred to as a bust. A bust, and in this case it's a bronze bust. Bronze is the metal it's made of. A bust is a sculpture that is made of the head of an individual. Maybe the shoulders come into it, but very little more than that. it demonstrates the Akkadian culture's incorporation of Sumerian culture. And I'm sorry, I called this Akkadian, this is Sumerian, and I'm sorry about that. This is Akkadian. All right, so Akkadian are looking back at the Sumerians and are incorporating, in this case, artistic choices that they made. So we see a somewhat more complex and textured blending of naturalism and abstraction here, right? Where there's close observation and attention to observable detail on the head of this figure, right? You can see the sculptor really trying to get the details right, get the proportions right, and things of that nature. We get the feeling that what we're looking at is meant to be a realistic representation of a very specific person, right? And not just sort of a generic, like, this is a face, right? We get the feeling that this is meant to look like the ruler who it is meant to represent. But then there are these, just like with the Sumerian lyre there, we see these very abstract representations of the hair and the beard. That is taken directly from Sumerian artistry before it. Central to any Mesopotamian city, the most prominent feature of any Mesopotamian city would be the ziggurat. That's what this one in particular is, the ziggurat of Ur, that would have been in the city of Ur, that is in present-day Iraq, that would have been built around 2100 BCE. The ziggurat would have been a terraced pyramid. A lot of this is gone, right? There would have been more to it moving upward like this. So if I move here, you can see there was a lot more to this ziggurat in its time. But it would have been this terraced brick pyramid. Terraced meaning steps, right? There are terraces that move up, as opposed to sort of the classic Egyptian pyramid that we're all familiar with. And it served as the center of worship in any city, and would have been topped by a temple. So this is an artist rendition by Frank Zhang of what the Great Ziggurat would have looked like originally. On top, up here, is a temple to Nana, the moon god. And this ziggurat and many other ziggurats would be aligned with the four cardinal directions, right? So they would have it would have been aligned with north, south, east, west, with terraces and staircases that get one closer and closer to the gods. That temple is at the very top because up there you would be the closest to where the gods reside. So petitions to the gods could be done as close to the gods as possible. The priests could be up there for doing that. And it may have even been seen as a place for gods to descend. Maybe the temple was seen as a place for gods to descend and then to come on down to earth. Again, I go back to the book of Genesis in the Judeo-Christian Bible. Many people believe that the story of the Tower of Babel, right, which you'll recall, if you're familiar with the story at all, the people of Babel were trying to build a tower that would allow them to reach heaven and to reach God. Many believe that was based on the idea of the ziggurat in Mesopotamia. Our second ancient, early ancient civilization is ancient Egypt, where the fertile Nile River Valley, which was protected by which was protected by desert on both sides, allowed civilization to flourish. And the art and architecture of ancient Egypt, interestingly, develops this distinctive style that remains relatively unchanged for about 2,500 years. That's important. It's in red. You should write it down. They developed a style of art that we'll talk about in a moment that then didn't change. For the most part, there were very small changes, but for the most part, it remained unchanged for 2,500 years. That's a long time to have one specific style of art. The Egyptian religious belief focused intensely on the afterlife, and as such, the preservation of the body and care for the dead. We'll talk about that much more in depth momentarily. Some important contributions that come from the ancient Egyptians that they passed down to the world, things that we use to this day. The 12-month calendar, that was an Egyptian development. They did a lot of medical research, again, because they were so interested in preserving the body after death, that a lot of medical research was done during this period of time, and a lot was learned about the human body that wasn't known before this time. Ancient Egypt had two regions. There was Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Now, don't be confused. When you look at the map here, let me see if I can move my video out of the way. All right, you look at the map of Egypt, and Lower Egypt is actually Lower Egypt is actually north, and Upper Egypt is actually south, which on a map looks very counterintuitive, but it's because it's referring to the river itself, the Nile River, that is. And since this is upstream, right, because the water is moving this way and emptying into the Mediterranean Sea, this is Upper Egypt. And since this is downstream, it's Lower Egypt. All right. Those are the two main regions of ancient Egypt. And there were three main periods. There was the Old Kingdom, there was the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, with all of their various dates listed there for you of when those existed. So, we all know ancient Egypt specifically for the pyramids. Even if you don't know very much about ancient Egypt, you know about the pyramids. You know that the pyramids were built by the ancient Egyptians. That true pyramid shape, that classic pyramid shape that we're all so familiar with, wasn't developed until the reign of King Khufu in ancient Egypt. So what we're looking at here, this is a complex that's made up of the burial monuments. That's what a pyramid is. The pyramid is a burial monument of Khufu and two of his successors. So we're looking at, like, granddad, dad, and grandson. As well as some smaller pyramids meant for wives and concubines and servants and things of that nature. The Great Pyramid, built by King Khufu, is still to this day the largest stone building in the world. The pyramids were designed and constructed with extreme mathematical precision, and these then become the symbol of the Old Kingdom. That's the interesting thing about ancient Egypt's connection in our minds and in popular culture with the pyramids, is that was actually a very brief time in Egyptian history. In the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom didn't build pyramids. We're also very familiar with the Great Sphinx, carved somewhere around 2560 BCE. It was also carved during the Old Kingdom and was placed to guard the complex of the Great Pyramids in Giza, as you can see right here. Right? It is a sphinx. It's this mythical creature with the body of a lion and the head of a human, and it's believed that the Sphinx's purpose specifically was to ward off any thieves or vandals who might want to break into the pyramids. Because look, whatever else the pyramids may have been, I just called them burial monuments, and that, for the most part, is what they were. But as I'm sure you know, there are all sorts of crazy ideas, as well as some where historians argue about what exactly they were used for. But whatever else they were, giant memorials to the gods, constructed but to make passing the threshold to the afterlife possible, or as a means of communicating with aliens, right? Whatever the case may be, they are a gigantic marker, right? Look at how big that thing is. That says, hey, are you looking for gold and treasure? Look no further. We have it right here. Here it is. So you need a sphinx to guard and look after and ward people away from it. Now, it didn't work. Within and underneath the pyramids is quite a complex of tunnels and stairways that are meant to act as burial chambers, but also to try to throw any would-be thieves or vandals off the trail. As you can see in this particular cross-section here, there actually were some thieves that did end up tunneling into, right? And it looks like they ended up finding sort of this false chamber that's below the ground, below the pyramid rather. But the king himself would have been buried here in a sarcophagus where, you know, it isn't as if ancient Egypt and all of its iconography isn't well ingrained in the sort of popular zeitgeist. We've seen this stuff before. And so you understand that kings and other important individuals eventually, at first it was just the kings, because the kings were considered to be gods who were living on earth to rule. At first, they were the only ones who were given these kinds of burials where they were mummified. But eventually, other people who were considered important were given these kind of burials as well. But so the individual, in this case, it's Tutankhamun, who, by the way, was buried in the Valley of the Kings, not under a pyramid. He's a much later king. By this point, the kings were referred to as pharaohs. They would have been mummified so that the body was preserved, and they would have been buried in a chamber that had on the wall all these different hieroglyphics and images that were meant to instruct the individual on what to do when they reached the afterlife. Because here was the belief. This is a vignette from the papyrus of Ani. Ani would have been one of these important individuals I was just talking about. And this would have been a papyrus for him. The belief was after death, one's body would rise again, and that body was going to be the thing that would move on to the afterlife. So Ani, which in this scroll, that right there is Ani. This would have been a scroll that was meant to instruct him on what to do. Because here is what was believed was going to happen when one immediately moved to the afterlife in the Egyptian lore. That you are going to be put on trial by all the gods. The gods are up there at the top sitting in a jury, waiting on your trial for what kind of a life you lived and whether or not you're going to be allowed into the afterlife. You have what's going to happen to you in this scenario is that there are going to be these scales that are set up, and on one side of the scale your heart is going to be placed, and your heart is burdened down with all of the things that you did in your life, good and bad. The bad things that you did in your life make that heart heavier. And so on the other side of the scale, you're going to have a feather that will be placed. And if you've lived a good life, your heart should be lighter than that feather. That feather should weigh down. Thoth is over here. He's the god who's waiting to write down an account of what happened. He's going to write down whether or not poor Ani's heart here is heavier or lighter than that feather. And this over here, this creature, is Ammit. And Ammit is waiting. If it turns out that heart that Ani's heart is heavier than that feather, Amit is waiting there to consume Ani. And when Amit consumes someone, that person enters complete and utter oblivion. You no longer exist in any form whatsoever. That's a scary idea, to not exist at all. Not even to have eternal damnation and torment in hell. You just cease to exist. Here's Anubis. Anubis is the one who's going to check on this. He's the one who's going to place the heart in the feather. He's the one who's going to be in charge of the scale. And on this papyrus, and sometimes on the walls of the tombs, would be written the incantations for the person being judged to speak to Anubis. So Ani might read some of the things that are written in these hieroglyphics here, or maybe they were written on the walls of his tomb. And he would say those things to Anubis to convince him to add a little extra weight, and maybe even his own hand, to this the feather side of this scale, and put a little extra weight and just cheat things for Ani. So if the feather is heavier than the heart, Ani is judged to have lived a good life and is allowed to go on and live the afterlife of his choosing. And oftentimes, the paintings on the walls of these tombs would depict the kind of afterlife that the individual who was buried there wanted to live. This one in particular is I always struggle with this name, so give me a moment. Nabaman, I believe. Nabaman. Ugh. Hunting birds. This would have been in his particular tomb, painted somewhere around 1400 BCE. And it is indicative of a couple of things. One, of the kind of afterlife that Nabaman wanted to live. Nabaman, that was how you pronounced it. It appears that Nabaman wanted to live out his afterlife on a boat, hunting birds and fishing with his wife and his daughter coming along for the ride with him. A rather beautiful way to think of one's afterlife. Spending eternity hunting and fishing, enjoying the things you enjoyed in life with the people that you loved in life coming along for the ride. But this is also indicative of the Egyptian style of art that, as I mentioned, went relatively unchanged for 2,500 years. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why Egyptian art looks like this. Because there was a big concern. The reason that bodies were mummified by the Egyptians is there was a concern that one was going to need their body in order to move on to the afterlife. But bodies decay. So mummification was a way of preserving that body. But just in case something went wrong and your body wasn't preserved well enough to be used, then you could, as a last resort, inhabit the image of yourself on the wall. And so as such, the image of that person needed to contain everything that person might need in the afterlife. And so the different parts of the body are represented in Egyptian art in the way that they are most recognizable. So what do I mean? Well, Nabaman, his wife, and his daughter, none of them are portrayed in a way where their face is looking outward toward you, the way I am, right? Why? Because a human face and all the features on it are much more identifiable when we look at it in profile, because one can see the nose, one can see the lips, one can see the chin, right? All that stuff is very identifiable as a result. The eye, on the other hand, you'll note, doesn't look like an eye does from the side, right? If I turn to the side, right, you don't really see a whole lot of my eye. And anyone else that you look at in profile, that's the case. But if you look at my eye straight on from the front, you can see my eyes quite well and you can identify what they are. So the Egyptians would often draw that eye as facing outward, straight out, rather than turned to the side. Where the head is turned in profile, however, the shoulders and the upper torso are turned as if they are pointed outward toward us. But then you get to the legs, and particularly the feet, and they're turned in profile again, because a foot is much more identifiable when it's turned this way as opposed to when it's turned towards you like this. Same with the arms and the hands, where they're sort of outward in akimbo in order to make sure that we can see those arms. Nothing is accidentally hidden. That was a way of ensuring that that body was seen from its most identifiable vantage points, each of the individual parts of the body, that is, should one need to inhabit that. But again, this is a nobleman who wants this to be his afterlife, right? Hunting with his wife and his daughter. However, there's something interesting happening with the depictions of the wife and the daughter, right? I'm not so sure that Nabaman was so much larger than his wife. And his child, his daughter, who doesn't look, when we just look at just the image of her herself, doesn't look like she's a toddler, but she's sure as the size of one. This is something that we see very often in Egyptian art, and we're going to talk about it. We'll see it repeated in later cultures as well, that we call hierarchical scale. It's in red. It's important. I'd write it down if I were you. Hierarchical scale is when what is depicted in a work of art is not scaled based on observation, right? Because if it was based on observation, Nabaman and his wife might be about the same size, right? Instead, hierarchical scale scales the elements within the image based on their importance. And Egypt would have been what is called a patriarchal society, meaning that it was ruled by men, a patriarchy. So, as the man of the family in this particular case, he's considered most important. So he gets to be the biggest. His wife is of secondary importance, so she's a little smaller. And the daughter, she's a child, and in a patriarchy, and to a certain extent, even to this day, children are considered the least important, and would certainly have been so in ancient Egypt. So she is really tiny, very small down there. That's hierarchical scale. All right, that brings us to the end of our discussion of the origins of human culture. When we next meet, we'll be talking about the ancient Greeks. Take care.